In the unforgiving winter of 1883, a single act of kindness could get you killed or save your soul. Sarah Callahan was a widow with nothing left but a frozen cabin and one dairy cow named Bessie, when a starving band of Apache warriors appeared on her ridge, looking not for a fight, but for survival. Sarah did the unthinkable. She didn't reach for her Winchester. She reached for her skinning knife and slaughtered her only source of food to feed them. The town called her a traitor. The law called her a fool. But 10 years later, when the fires of greed came to burn Sarah to the ground, those warriors remembered, and the debt they repaid shook the Arizona Territory to its very core. This is the true story of the widow of Granite Peak. The wind howled through the chinks in the log walls like a dying wolf. It was late December in the Arizona Territory, a winter so fierce the elders in the nearby settlements claimed it was nature trying to scour the white man off the map. Sarah Callahan sat by a dying hearth, wrapping a tattered wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 42, the frontier had carved lines into her face that made her look 60. Her husband, John, had died 2 years prior in a mining accident, leaving her with 40 acres of rocky soil, a drafty cabin, and Bessie, a Guernsey cow that was currently shivering in the lean-to attached to the kitchen. Bessie was life. Bessie provided the milk Sarah traded for flour and coffee. Without that cow, Sarah was dead. It was simple arithmetic. A heavy thud against the doorframe made Sarah jump. She grabbed the double-barreled shotgun leaning against the mantel. She didn't cock it. The click was too loud, but she leveled it at the heavy oak door. "Who's there?" she called out. Her voice was steady, despite the trembling of her hands. There was no answer, only the whistling wind. Then, another thud. A body leaning against the wood. Sarah moved to the window, scraping away a layer of frost. Through the swirling white darkness, she saw shapes. Not one, but several. They weren't on horses. They were on foot, huddled together against the gale. She unbarred the door and cracked it open an inch, the barrel of the gun leading the way. Standing on her porch was a tall man, his skin bronzed and cracked from the cold. He wore buckskins that were worn thin, and his black hair was matted with ice. Behind him stood a woman clutching a bundle, a baby, and 2 young boys whose eyes were hollowed out by hunger. They were Apache. The very word sent shivers of terror through the settlers in the valley. Stories of raids and scalpings were told nightly in the saloons of Oak Haven. But Sarah didn't see warriors. She saw ribs protruding through skin. She saw death waiting to claim them. The tall man looked at the gun, then at Sarah. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply pointed to the woman and the silent, unmoving bundle in her arms. "Water," he rasped, his English broken and heavy. Sarah looked at the gun in her hands. She knew what the town would say. She knew what the sheriff would tell her to do. Shoot or shut the door. She lowered the barrel. "Come inside," she said, stepping back, "before the cold takes you all." They entered cautiously, bringing the smell of wet leather and sage into the small room. The woman sat near the hearth, trying to warm the infant. The baby didn't cry. It was too weak. Sarah looked at her pantry. She had a bag of dried beans and a half jar of molasses. It wasn't enough. Not for 5 people. She looked out the back window toward the lean-to. She looked back at the Apache mother, whose eyes were fixed on Sarah with a pleading intensity that transcended language. Sarah set the gun down. She grabbed her heavy coat and a long, sharp butchering knife from the table. "Stay here," she ordered. She went out into the blizzard. The wind felt like broken glass against her cheeks. She entered the lean-to. Bessie lowed softly, nudging Sarah's pocket for a treat that wasn't there. Tears froze on Sarah's face. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, stroking the cow's velvet nose. "I'm so sorry." It took her an hour of bloody, heart-breaking work in the freezing cold. When she returned to the cabin, she was covered in blood, dragging a massive haunch of meat. The Apache man stood up, his eyes widening. He knew what a cow meant to a settler. He knew the price she had just paid. Sarah threw the meat on the table. "Eat," she said, her voice cracking. "All of you, eat." They stayed for 3 days while the storm raged. They ate every scrap of Bessie. They slept on Sarah's floor. They spoke little, but the tall man, who she learned was named Red Hawk, watched her constantly. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun glinted off the white drifts. Red Hawk stood at the door. He touched his chest, then pointed to Sarah. "You gave life," he said solemnly. "We do not forget." He pulled a small, rough leather pouch from his belt and placed it on the table. Then, without another word, he and his family disappeared into the tree line, leaving Sarah alone in the silence, with nothing but a leather pouch and an empty barn. Inside the pouch was a single, rough turquoise stone, carved in the shape of a turtle. Word traveled faster than the wind in the territory. 2 weeks later, Sarah hitched her old mule to the wagon and rode into Oakhaven. She needed supplies, and she had the turquoise stone. She hoped it was worth something. As she walked into Patterson's general store, the conversation stopped dead. Men leaning against the cracker barrels straightened up. Mrs. Gable, the town gossip, pulled her skirts away as Sarah passed. Sarah approached the counter. "Morning, Mr. Patterson. I need a sack of flour and some coffee." Frank Patterson, a man Sarah had known for 10 years, didn't look her in the eye. He continued wiping the counter. "We're out, Sarah." Sarah frowned. She could see the sacks of flour stacked behind him. "Frank, the flour is right there." "I said we're out," Frank said, his voice hard. He looked up, his eyes cold. "For you." "I don't understand." "We heard what happened." A voice boomed from the doorway. Sarah turned. It was Caleb Vance. Vance was the wealthiest man in the valley. He owned the slaughterhouse, the bank, and half the ranch land. He was a large man with a thick mustache and eyes like flint. He had been trying to buy Sarah's 40 acres for pennies on the dollar since John died. It was prime grazing land with a natural spring. "We heard you hosted a war party," Vance said, stepping into the store. The air grew thick with tension. "We heard you fed 'em, comforted 'em." "I fed a starving family, Caleb," Sarah said, her chin high. "A mother and children." "They're savages," Mrs. Gable shrieked from the corner. "They killed the Miller family 3 years ago." "These people were dying," Sarah retorted. "I did what a Christian woman should do." Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A Christian woman doesn't slaughter her livelihood to feed the enemy, Mrs. Callahan. You ain't got a cow no more. You got no money. You got no food." He stepped closer, invading her space. "You're a traitor to your race, Sarah, and nobody in Oakhaven does business with traitors." Sarah looked around the room. She saw shame in some eyes, but fear in most. Vance owned them too. "I still have my land," Sarah said quietly. "For now," Vance grinned. "But taxes are coming due in spring, and without that cow, well," he pulled a cigar from his vest. "Tell you what, I'm a generous man. I'll give you $50 for the deed right now. You can take the stagecoach east. Go back to civilization where you belong." $50 was an insult. The land was worth $500. "My husband is buried on that land," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. "I'm not selling to you, Caleb Vance. Not today. Not ever." She turned to leave, but Vance grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising. "You listen to me," he hissed, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "You think you're noble? You're just a foolish woman alone in the wild. Nature is going to kill you, Sarah. And if nature doesn't, accidents happen." Sarah wrenched her arm free. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the turquoise turtle. She slammed it onto the counter in front of Frank Patterson. "This is worth 10 sacks of flour," she declared. "Take it, or I'll tell every miner in the hills that you cheat on your scales." Frank looked at Vance. Vance gave a slight, dismissive nod. Frank slid a small sack of flour across the counter. "Take it, and don't come back." Sarah walked out of the store, the flour heavy in her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the eyes of the town burning into her back. She was an outcast now, a pariah. As she loaded her wagon, she saw Sheriff Pendergast watching her from the jailhouse porch. He didn't tip his hat. He just spat tobacco juice into the dust and looked away. Sarah climbed onto the seat and snapped the reins. She was alone, truly alone. But as she rode back toward the mountains, she didn't know that she wasn't as alone as she thought. High up on the ridge, watching the dust of her wagon, a pair of dark eyes watched. And then a signal mirror flashed once, bright as a star, before disappearing into the rocks. The spring thaw of 1884 brought no relief to Granite Peak. The snow melted into a slush of mud and ice, turning the roads into quagmires. For Sarah Callahan, the melting snow revealed only the stark reality of her poverty. The flour was gone. The woodpile was a scattering of chips and bark. She spent her days scavenging for early roots and setting snares for rabbits. But the game was scarce, driven deep into the high country by the harsh winter. Hunger returned, a gnawing rat in her belly that never slept. One morning, a week after the last of the snow had vanished, Sarah stepped onto her porch, a bucket of grey water in her hand. She froze. Lying on the rough-hewn planks was a buck, a large mule deer, freshly dressed and cleaned, wrapped in a deerskin tarp. Next to it sat a woven basket filled with piñon nuts and dried berries. Sarah looked around wildly. The forest was silent, save for the chatter of a blue jay. "Hello," she called out. No answer. She knelt by the deer. It was a clean kill, a single arrow through the heart. The arrow had been removed, the wound sewn shut with sinew. It wasn't just food. It was a gift prepared with respect. That night, she feasted on roast venison, the first fresh meat she had tasted in months. She slept with a full belly, but her dreams were filled with the dark eyes of Red Hawk. As the weeks turned into months, the ghosts kept coming. Every new moon, Sarah would find something. Sometimes it was a stack of cured beaver pelts, worth a small fortune at the trading post in the next county. Sometimes it was a bundle of medicinal herbs when she was down with a fever. Once, when her roof began to leak during the summer monsoons, she woke up to find a stack of freshly cut cedar shingles neatly piled by the barn. She never saw them. She never heard them, but she knew they were there. The Apache she had saved were watching over her, but the town of Oak Haven noticed her survival. "She's a witch," Mrs. Gable whispered in the church pews. "No woman survives alone out there without the devil's help." Caleb Vance had a different theory. He sat in his office at the bank, staring at the map on his wall. Sarah's land was a jagged tooth in the middle of his empire. "She's not farming," Vance growled to his foreman, a scarred man named Dutch. "She's got no stock, no crops. Yet I saw her in Prescott last month wearing a new dress and buying a Winchester rifle." "Maybe she's mining," Dutch suggested, spitting tobacco into a brass spittoon. "Maybe she found a vein on that rocky slope." Vance's eyes lit up with greed. "Gold! That has to be it. That old fool John Callahan always said there was color in that stream. Vance slammed his fist on the desk. Squeeze her, Dutch. Harder this time. I want her off that land before the first snow falls. 2 nights later, Sarah was awakened by the sound of tearing wood. She grabbed her new Winchester and ran to the window. In the moonlight, she saw 3 riders tearing down her corral fencing. They were tying ropes to the posts and dragging them down, laughing drunkenly. "Get off my land!" Sarah shouted, levering around into the chamber. One of the riders, a man she recognized as one of Vance's hired guns, laughed. "Or what, widow? You gonna shoot us?" He pulled a torch from his saddlebag and lit it. "Boss says this wood is dry. Might catch fire real easy." He raised his arm to throw the torch onto the roof of her root cellar. Thwip. The sound was soft, like a bird taking flight. The rider screamed. The torch dropped from his hand, fizzling out in the dirt. He clutched his shoulder, where a black feathered arrow now protruded. "What in blazes?" Dutch yelled, his horse rearing. Thwip, thwip. 2 more arrows struck the ground, inches from the horse's hooves. They didn't come from the cabin. They came from the tree line, from the darkness that surrounded the clearing. "It's an ambush!" the injured man shrieked. "Apache!" The horses panicked. Dutch fired his revolver blindly into the woods, the muzzle flashes lighting up the terror in his eyes. But there was no return fire, just the silent, deadly whistle of arrows. 1 arrow took Dutch's hat clean off his head, pinning it to a fence post. That was enough. "Ride, ride, damn you!" Dutch bellowed. The 3 men spurred their horses, galloping away into the night, as if the hounds of hell were snapping at their heels. Sarah stood at the window, her heart pounding. She watched the dust settle. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. She looked toward the dark forest line. She couldn't see anyone, but she raised her hand in a silent wave. From the darkness, the call of a coyote echoed. It was a little too rhythmic, a little too human. It was an answer. Sarah Callahan realized then that she wasn't just a widow on a failing farm. She was a protected woman, and she had an army. Years rolled by like tumbleweeds. 1 winter became 5, 5 became 8. Sarah Callahan changed. The timid woman who had trembled at the door was gone. In her place stood a figure of iron and grace. Her hair had turned a striking steel grey, pulled back in a severe bun. She wore men's trousers under her skirts for working, and carried her Winchester with the ease of a soldier. She bypassed Oakhaven completely. Once a month, she rode 2 days to the city of Prescott. There, she met with a man named Elias Thorne. No, not Thorne, that name is cursed. A man named Elias Sterling. Sterling was a fair trader who asked no questions. He bought the exquisite furs, the turquoise jewelry, and the small nuggets of raw gold Sarah brought him. He paid her fair market value, depositing the money into an account she had opened under her maiden name. Sarah was becoming wealthy. But she lived simply. She fixed up the cabin, turning it into a fortress of comfort. She bought books. She bought a sturdy roan gelding named Judge. But back in Oakhaven, the mystery of the widow of Granite Peak had turned into a festering wound for Caleb Vance. Vance had aged poorly. Drink and rage had made him bloated and red-faced. His obsession with Sarah's land had consumed him. He had bought every acre surrounding her. He had dammed the creek upstream to cut off her water. But the natural spring on her land, the one the Apache knew about, never ran dry. It was the 9th winter since the blizzard. 1892. Vance walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon and slammed a piece of paper on the bar. The room went quiet. "She's stealing from us," Vance shouted to the room full of miners and ranchers. "That woman is mining gold on land that belongs to the district. She's consorting with savages to smuggle it out." Sheriff Pendergast, now old and grey, looked up from his whiskey. "You got proof, Caleb." "Proof is in her pocket," Vance spat. "I had a man follow her to Prescott. She deposited $2,000 in the bank there. 2,000! Where does a widow get that kind of money farming rocks?" A murmur went through the crowd. $2,000 was a fortune. Jealousy, ugly and green, began to rise in the room. "She's a witch," someone muttered. "She's a traitor," another said. "Feeding Indians while we struggle." Vance climbed onto a chair. "The law won't help us," he shouted, glaring at the sheriff. "The courts are too slow, but this is our valley. That gold belongs to us." He looked around, catching the eyes of desperate men. Men who had lost their claims. Men who were hungry. "I say we go up there," Vance said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "We go up there, and we find out where she's hiding it. We take what's ours. And if she resists, well, accidents happen in the high country." The cheer that went up wasn't loud. It was a low, angry rumble. A mob was born. Meanwhile, at the cabin, Sarah was preparing for her yearly visitors. It was the anniversary of the storm. As always, she had prepared a meal. But this year was different. Red Hawk didn't just bring his family, he brought the elders. They arrived at dusk, a dozen of them, moving like shadows. They entered her cabin, filling the space with solemn reverence. Red Hawk was older now, his face lined, but his back was straight as a lance. The baby Sarah had saved was now a 10-year-old boy named Little Bear. He stood before Sarah, his eyes wide with awe. Red Hawk spoke, his English much improved over the years. 10 winters, he said. 10 winters you have been sister to the Apache. You have kept our secret. You have shared your fire. He gestured to the elders. One of them stepped forward, holding a blanket. He unfolded it to reveal a vest made of white buckskin, intricately beaded with patterns of blue and red. "This is the vest of the peacekeeper," Red Hawk said. "It tells the story of the woman who gave the cow. It is a story we tell our children." Sarah ran her fingers over the beads, tears welling in her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "But surely the debt is paid, Red Hawk. You have given me so much more than a cow." Red Hawk shook his head. "There is no debt between family, only bond." Suddenly, a dog barked outside, then another. Red Hawk stiffened. He turned his head, listening to the wind. "Men," he said softly. "Many men. Horses. Iron." Sarah went to the window. Far down the valley road she saw torches, a long line of them, snake-like, winding up the mountain toward her home. "Vance," she breathed. She turned to Red Hawk. "You must go. If they find you here, they will kill you all. They are looking for an excuse." Red Hawk looked at the torches, then at Sarah. His expression was unreadable. "They come for you?" he asked. "They come for my land, for the gold they think I have." Sarah grabbed her rifle. "Please, Red Hawk, take your family. Go out the back way, into the canyons. I can hold them off." Red Hawk looked at the vest in her hands. He looked at the boy, Little Bear. "Go," Sarah commanded, her voice fierce. "I saved you once. Let me save you again." Red Hawk nodded slowly. He signaled to his people. They melted away into the back room and out into the night, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Sarah was alone again. She blew out the lantern. She checked the load in her Winchester. She walked onto the porch and sat in her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, waiting for the snake of fire to arrive. The mob arrived an hour later. There were at least 20 of them, led by Caleb Vance on a massive black stallion. They carried torches, ropes, and rifles. The alcohol from the saloon had fueled their courage, turning them into a chaotic, shouting beast. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows against the cabin walls. "Sarah Callahan!" Vance bellowed. "Come out!" Sarah didn't move from her rocker. The darkness of the porch hid her face, but the barrel of her Winchester caught the glint of the firelight. "I'm right here, Caleb," she called back, her voice calm and cold. "You're trespassing." "We have a warrant," Vance lied. For tax evasion. And treason." "There is no warrant," Sarah said, "and you are no lawman. Turn around, Caleb. Take your drunk friends and go home." "Burn it," someone shouted from the back. "Burn the witch out." A bottle filled with kerosene sailed through the air. It smashed against the side of the barn, the new barn Sarah had built 2 years ago. Flames roared to life instantly, licking up the dry wood. "No!" Sarah screamed. She stood up and fired a warning shot into the air. The mob scattered, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Gunfire erupted. Bullets chewed into the wood of the porch railing. Sarah dropped to the floor, crawling back inside the cabin. She kicked the door shut and barred it. The sound of the burning barn was a roar now. The heat radiated through the cabin walls. "Come out, Sarah!" Vance laughed from behind a boulder. "Or you'll roast like a pig." Inside, Sarah moved from window to window, returning fire. She was a good shot, but she was pinned down. She saw men creeping closer with more torches. They were going to circle the cabin. Glass shattered as a bullet took out the kitchen window. Another round punched through the door. She was trapped. This was it. After 10 years of survival, she was going to die because of one man's greed. She looked at the white buckskin vest lying on the table. She picked it up and put it on. If she was going to die, she would die wearing her honor. Smoke began to seep under the door. They had set the porch on fire. Sarah coughed, her eyes stinging. She reloaded her rifle with trembling hands. She had 5 rounds left. She would save the last one for herself. She would not give Vance the satisfaction of dragging her through the streets. Suddenly, the shooting stopped. The shouting outside turned from anger to confusion, then to terror. What was that? Vance's voice cut through the smoke. A high, piercing war cry echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound that made the blood freeze in the veins of every man in the clearing. It wasn't one voice. It was 100. From the ridge above the cabin, a line of fire appeared. Flaming arrows arched high into the night sky, raining down not on the cabin, but on the mob. "Apache!" a man screamed. "It's a war party." Chaos erupted. The men who had been brave a moment ago dropped their torches and scrambled for their horses. But the horses were gone, cut loose in the darkness. Shapes moved through the smoke. They were not ghosts this time. They were warriors, painted for war. Red Hawk had not left. He had not run to the canyons. He had gone only as far as the ridge, where the rest of his band had been waiting in the shadows, guarding the woman who was their sister. Sarah peered through the broken window. She saw Vance trying to mount his horse, which was bucking wildly. A warrior dropped from the roof of the burning barn, landing right behind Vance. It was Red Hawk. He didn't use a weapon. He grabbed Vance by the collar and dragged him off the horse, throwing him into the dirt. Vance scrambled backward, pleading, "No, no, I have money, I have gold." Red Hawk stood over him, a silhouette against the inferno of the barn. He raised a heavy war club, but he didn't strike. Instead, he looked toward the cabin door. Sarah kicked the bar away and threw the door open. She stepped out onto the burning porch, the white vest glowing in the firelight, her rifle in hand. The flames framed her like an avenging angel. The fighting stopped. The mob was surrounded. Apache warriors stood with bows drawn, encircling the terrified townsmen. Red Hawk looked at Sarah. He stepped aside, leaving Vance cowering in the dirt at her feet. "This is your justice, sister," Red Hawk said. Sarah looked down at the man who had tormented her for a decade, the man who had turned her town against her, the man who tried to burn her alive. Vance looked up, sweat and soot streaking his face. "Sarah, please. It was a misunderstanding." Sarah cocked the lever of her Winchester. The sound was loud in the sudden silence. She aimed the gun right between his eyes. Vance squeezed his eyes shut and sobbed. Sarah stood there for a long moment. The heat of the fire warmed her back. The anger in her blood was hot enough to melt iron. Then she slowly lowered the barrel. "Get up," she said, her voice like ice. Vance opened his eyes. He scrambled to his feet, shaking. "Get out of my valley," Sarah said. "If I ever see you, or any of these men, on my land again, I won't be the one who stops them." She gestured to the circle of painted warriors. Vance nodded frantically. Yes, Sarah, I swear. Go." Vance ran. He didn't wait for a horse. He ran into the darkness, stumbling and falling. The rest of the mob followed, fleeing on foot, leaving their weapons and their pride in the dirt. The Apache did not pursue them. They let them run, their laughter chasing the men down the mountain. As the sound of the fleeing men faded, Sarah slumped against the porch railing. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by exhaustion. The barn was lost. It collapsed with a mighty crash, sending sparks into the sky. Red Hawk walked up the steps. He looked at the burning ruins, then at Sarah. "The wood will be replaced," he said simply. "We will build it higher." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, she wept. She wept for the fear, for the loneliness, and for the overwhelming gratitude of not being alone. Red Hawk placed a hand on her shoulder. "The cow is gone," he said, referencing that first night so long ago. "But the herd remains." He pointed to the warriors. "We are your herd now." The sun rose over Granite Peak the morning after the raid, illuminating a scene that would be talked about in the Arizona Territory for 50 years. The air still smelled of wet char and sulfur, but the fear that had choked the valley for a decade had evaporated with the morning mist. Sarah Callahan sat on her scorched porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. She watched as the impossible happened. They didn't just rebuild the barn, they improved it. Dozens of Apache men, women, and even children had descended from the ridges at first light. They didn't ask for permission, they simply set to work. Red Hawk directed them with quiet, efficient hand signals. They felled tall ponderosa pines, stripping the bark with rhythmic precision. They hauled river stones for a new foundation, passing rocks down a human chain that stretched from the creek to the clearing. By noon, a wagon approached from the town road. Sarah stiffened, reaching for the rifle that now never left her side. But it wasn't Vance. It was Sheriff Pendergast, riding alone, his hat in his hand. He stopped his horse at the gate, eyeing the lines of Apache warriors who paused their work to watch him. The tension was palpable, a bowstring pulled tight. Sarah walked down the steps. "Sheriff." "Mrs. Callahan," Pendergast said, his voice gravelly and tired. He looked at the burned remains of the old barn, then at the rising skeleton of the new one. He looked at Red Hawk, who stood atop a pile of lumber, holding a sledgehammer, staring down at the lawman with the gaze of a king. "Vance is gone," Pendergast said, spitting into the dust. "Packed his bags this morning, took the first stagecoach to Santa Fe, said the air here didn't agree with him no more." Sarah nodded slowly. "And the others?" "Quiet as church mice. Most of them are too ashamed to show their faces. The rest are too scared." Pendergast shifted in his saddle. "I reckon you won't be having any more trouble, Sarah. Not from Oak Haven." He paused, looking back at the Apache. I never thought I'd see the day. White and red, working a claim together. They aren't working a claim, Sheriff, Sarah said softly. They're helping a neighbor. It's something this town forgot how to do a long time ago. Pendergast nodded grimly. He put his hat back on. I'll be seeing you, Sarah. If you need, well, I guess you don't need anything from me. He rode away, a man whose authority had been rendered obsolete by a higher law, the law of loyalty. The construction took 3 weeks. When it was finished, the barn was a masterpiece of frontier engineering. It was 2 stories high, built of interlocking logs that could withstand a cannonball. They built a new corral, reinforced with ironwood. They even dug a new irrigation ditch from the spring to her vegetable patch. But the true change wasn't in the buildings, it was in the valley itself. Sarah Callahan became an untouchable figure. The widow of Granite Peak was no longer a target. She was a legend. Miners passing through would tip their hats with profound respect when they saw her riding judge into town. No one dared cheat her. No one dared trespass. Caleb Vance's land was eventually foreclosed on by the bank and sold off in parcels. Ironically, Sarah bought the 40 acres directly adjacent to hers, the very land Vance had tried to steal from her. She paid in raw gold nuggets, slapped onto the bank counter by a hand that had grown strong and calloused. The years settled into a peaceful rhythm. The seasons turned. Sarah's hair turned from steel grey to snow white. Red Hawk grew old too, his movements slowing, but his mind remaining sharp as a hawk's talons. Every Sunday, Sarah would cook a massive meal, and every Sunday, a few guests would come down from the mountain. Sometimes it was Red Hawk, sometimes his son, Little Bear, who was now a strapping warrior with a family of his own. They would sit at her table, breaking bread, sharing stories of the hunt and the changing world. The town of Oakhaven eventually accepted this strange alliance. They stopped calling her a witch and started calling her the Peacekeeper. They realized that as long as Sarah Callahan was happy, the Apache left the settlement alone. She was the shield that protected them all, though they had done nothing to deserve it. But time, the one enemy Sarah could not fight with a Winchester, eventually came for her. The winter of 1903 descended upon the Arizona Territory with a vengeance that rivaled the great blizzard of 20 years prior. The wind screamed through the canyons of Granite Peak, stripping the last of the aspen leaves and burying the high passes in 10 feet of drift. It was a winter that killed cattle and froze water in the basin, a reminder that no matter how much civilization crept into the West, with its telegraph wires and railroad tracks, nature remained the undisputed master. Sarah Callahan was now 62 years old, though the frontier had taxed her body a decade beyond that. The steel-grey hair had turned to the color of driven snow, and the hands that had once butchered a cow in a freezing lean-to were now gnarled with rheumatism. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane carved from polished ironwood, a gift from Little Bear, who was no longer little, but a man of 30 with a family of his own. For the last few years, the relationship between the cabin and the mountain had evolved into something profound and permanent. Sarah was no longer just a protected asset. She was the matriarch of a dual family. The town of Oakhaven had grown, swelling with new copper money, but the Callahan homestead remained a sanctuary, an island of the old ways. As the storm raged outside, rattling the heavy shutters of the cabin, the atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of burning sage and pinon wood. The fire roared in the stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls now adorned not just with settlers' tools, but with woven baskets, beadwork, and eagle feathers. Sarah lay in her heavy oak bed, propped up by pillows stuffed with goose down. Her breathing was shallow, a dry rasp that filled the quiet room. She was not alone. She had never been alone. Not really, since that first night. Sitting in the chair by her bedside was Red Hawk. He was ancient now, his face a road map of deep creases and weathered skin, his hair 2 long braids of silver. He did not wear the war paint of the raid a decade ago. He wore soft buckskins and a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He held Sarah's fragile hand in his own, his grip gentle but firm, an anchor keeping her tethered to the world for just a few moments longer. "The wind is angry tonight," Sarah whispered, her eyes fluttering open. They were cloudy, but the spark of defiance remained. "It sings for you, sister," Red Hawk replied, his voice low and resonant, like stones grinding in a riverbed. "It knows the Great Spirit is preparing to welcome a warrior." Sarah managed a weak, wheezing chuckle. "A warrior? I'm just a stubborn old woman who didn't know when to quit." "To feed the hungry when you have nothing is the act of a chief," Red Hawk said solemnly. "To stand against the fire is the act of a warrior. You are both." Sarah looked around the room. In the shadows, other figures stood silently. Little Bear was there, tears streaming openly down his face, a display of emotion he would never show before other men. But here, in this room, he was a son losing a mother. There was the medicine man, Singing Wind, who was rhythmically shaking a small gourd rattle, chanting a prayer for safe passage. "Is everything ready?" Sarah asked, her gaze shifting to the heavy iron lockbox that sat on the table near the window. Red Hawk nodded. "Mr. Sterling has been summoned. The papers are safe." "Good," Sarah breathed, closing her eyes again. "They'll come, Red Hawk, when I'm gone. The vultures. Vance is gone, but there are always new ones. Men from the city. Men with paper and laws." "Let them come," Red Hawk said. "We have faced bullets. We can face paper." "No," Sarah said, her voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength. She squeezed his hand. "You fight bullets with arrows. You fight paper. With paper. That box is your shield." The hours stretched on. The storm outside intensified, isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. It was a holy silence, shared between 2 people from warring worlds who had found a peace that politicians and generals could never understand. Near dawn, the wind died down. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Sarah looked at Red Hawk one last time. The memories of 20 years flooded her eyes. The terror of the first knock, the taste of the venison left on her porch, the sight of the burning barn, and the white vest she had worn into the fire. "I gave a cow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I got a life." "You gave hope," Red Hawk corrected her gently. Sarah smiled. It was a look of pure, unburdened peace. She took a breath, deep and shuddering, and then let it out. She did not take another. Red Hawk sat motionless for a long time. He did not wail. He did not cry out. He simply pressed her hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. "Go well, sister," he whispered in his native tongue. "The hunting grounds are green, and the herds are vast." The news of Sarah Callahan's death hit Oak Haven like a thunderclap. Despite the town's mixed history with her, she had become a landmark, as permanent as the granite peaks looming above. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later. The weather had cleared, leaving the valley sparkling under a blanket of pristine white snow. The air was crisp and biting. The Oak Haven Community Church was a sturdy brick building, the pride of the town's newfound prosperity. On the morning of the funeral, it was packed to capacity. The mayor was there. Sheriff Pendergast, now retired and walking with a limp, sat in the front row. Bankers, miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers filled the pews, wearing their Sunday black. There was a buzzing curiosity beneath the somber mood. Everyone knew Sarah had no living relatives. Everyone knew she owned 80 acres of the prime valley floor, including the only year-round spring. The question on everyone's mind, hidden behind handkerchiefs and prayer books, was, who gets the land? Speculators from Prescott had already arrived, circling like coyotes. They whispered in the back of the church about auction prices and grazing rights. Then the doors opened. The hush that fell over the congregation was instant and absolute. Entering the church was Elias Sterling, the lawyer from Prescott, carrying a leather briefcase. But he was not alone. Behind him walked Red Hawk. The old chief walked with a dignity that made the pews seem small. He was followed by Little Bear, and then another, and another. They did not stop. They filed into the church, silent and stoic. They were not wearing the rags of beggars. They wore their finest buckskins, adorned with beadwork that caught the light from the stained glass windows. The ushers, terrified, tried to block the aisle. "Here now, you can't—" Sheriff Pendergast stood up from the front row. He turned around, his hand resting on the cane. "Let 'em in," he barked. She was their family more than she was ours. The ushers stepped back. The Apache filled the back half of the church, standing along the walls when the pews ran out. They brought the smell of wood smoke and leather into the perfumed air of the congregation. It was a visual clash of civilizations, brought together by one woman's coffin. The service was awkward. Father O'Malley stumbled through the liturgy, his eyes darting nervously to the back of the room. When the eulogies were offered, few townsfolk spoke. What could they say? They had shunned her. They had judged her. When it was time to move to the gravesite, the procession was a mile long. The black hearse, drawn by 2 black horses, led the way to the frozen earth of the cemetery. They lowered Sarah into the ground next to her husband, John. The soil thudded hollowly onto the pine box. When the priest finished the final prayer, Elias Sterling stepped forward. He was a tall, thin man with spectacles, known for his obsession with the letter of the law. He stood on a small wooden crate to be seen above the crowd. He opened his briefcase. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced, his voice carrying in the thin mountain air. Mrs. Callahan left explicit instructions that her last will and testament be read here, at her graveside, in the presence of all witnesses, both from the town and the tribe. The crowd stepped closer. The speculators checked their pocket watches, ready to make bids. "I will skip the minor bequests," Sterling said, adjusting his glasses. "To the church, she leaves her Bible. To Sheriff Pendergast, she leaves her rifle, with the note, 'To remind you which way to point it.'" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the crowd. Pendergast smiled grimly and tipped his hat. "And now, to the matter of the estate," Sterling continued. He paused, looking at the greedy faces in the crowd. "The house, the barns, the livestock, the 80 acres of deeded land, and the water rights associated thereof." He took a deep breath. "Mrs. Callahan has directed that the entirety of the estate be placed into a perpetual trust." "A trust?" the banker shouted. "Controlled by who?" "Controlled," Sterling said, his voice hardening, "by the White Mountain Apache tribe, specifically the lineage of the man known as Red Hawk." The silence was deafening. It was broken by a shout of outrage. "You can't do that!" It was a man named Miller, a cattle baron who had been eyeing the spring. "Indians can't own deeded property. It's against the territorial charter." "Actually," Sterling cut in, sharp as a knife, "Mrs. Callahan anticipated your objection. She did not leave it to them as individuals. She left it to the Callahan Apache Sanctuary Corporation, a legal entity she and I formed 5 years ago. The board of directors consists of myself, Red Hawk, and Little Bear. The papers are filed in Prescott, Santa Fe, and Washington, D.C. Sterling held up the document, the seal of the territory visible to all. "This land is private property," Sterling declared. "It is fully paid for, and the charter states that it is to be used as a wintering ground and sanctuary for the tribe, forever. Any attempt to trespass, graze cattle, or divert water will be met with the full force of the United States legal system." He looked over the rim of his glasses at Miller. "And Mrs. Callahan also set aside a substantial fund to hire Pinkertons to enforce these boundaries, should the local law prove insufficient." The townspeople were stunned. They had been outmaneuvered. Sarah hadn't just given the land back to the natives. She had used the white man's own bureaucracy to lock it down tighter than a drum. It was a masterstroke of irony. Miller turned red, sputtering. He looked at the back of the crowd where the Apache warriors stood. They hadn't moved. They hadn't spoken. But as the weight of the lawyer's words settled, a subtle shift occurred. They stood taller. Red Hawk stepped forward, moving through the parted crowd to the edge of the open grave. He ignored the angry murmurs of the cattlemen. He looked down at the coffin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the turquoise turtle, the same one he had given her 20 years ago in exchange for the cow. It was polished smooth, warm from his hand. He dropped it onto the wood. Thud. Then he turned to the town. For the first time, he spoke to them directly in English. "You saw a crazy woman," Red Hawk said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You saw a traitor. You saw a witch." He pointed to the grave. "We saw a mother." He looked at Miller, then at the banker. "The land does not belong to you. It does not belong to us. It belongs to her. We are just the guardians." He signaled to his people. "We go home now." The Apache turned as one. They didn't walk back toward the reservation boundaries. They walked toward the Callahan cabin. They walked toward the barns they had built. They walked onto their land, heads held high, passing the stunned townspeople who stood frozen in the snow. One by one, the people of Oak Haven realized the magnitude of what had happened. Sarah Callahan had forced them to live next door to the people they feared. She had forced integration through the sheer stubbornness of her will. Sheriff Pendergast watched them go. He looked at the angry cattle baron, Miller. "Go home, Miller," Pendergast said quietly. "It's over. She won." "It ain't right," Miller spat. "Maybe not to you," Pendergast said, looking at the headstone. "But I reckon it's the first right thing that's happened in this valley since we got here." The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving only the fresh mound of earth under the grey winter sky. In the years that followed, the Callahan Sanctuary became a legend in the West. It was a strange place, a working ranch run by Apache cowboys, a place where the ancient songs echoed off the walls of a settler's log cabin. It became a prosperous hub of trade, proving that the two worlds could coexist if given a chance. Sarah Callahan was gone, but she was everywhere. She was in the water that flowed from the spring. She was in the strong timber of the barn. She was in the laughter of Little Bear's children as they played in the field where Bessie the cow had once grazed. She had given her last possession to save a starving family. In return, they had given her immortality. They ensured that long after the names of the bankers and the cattle barons were forgotten, the name of the widow of Granite Peak would be spoken with reverence around the fires of winter. Karma, it turned out, was not just a force of nature, it was a contract, and Sarah Callahan had signed it in blood and milk, sealing a bond that even death could not break. What a journey! Sarah Callahan didn't just survive the Wild West, she mastered it through the power of radical kindness. In a world of guns and greed, she proved that a loaf of bread and an open door were the most powerful weapons of all. She gave away her last lifeline, her only cow, and in return, she gained an army, a legacy, and a family that protected her until her dying breath. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we were tested like that, if we had to choose between our own survival and helping a stranger, what would we do? If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets us find more lost history like this. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a saga from the frontier. Share this video with someone who believes that good deeds always come back around. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.